Hello, good evening, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Today, this is the second session of the virtual summit on resilient and regenerative food systems. And we're focusing on addressing climate risks and food security in the face of COVID-19 and beyond. We have two speakers for the day, Mr. Sönke Kreft, who's the Executive Director of Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and Mr. Kairos dela Cruz, who is an Associate for Climate Policy at the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. And I'm Vositha Wijenayake, the Executive Director of SLYCAN Trust. Before we go into the presentations, I'd like to request the two speakers to briefly introduce themselves. And I will start with Sönke, if that's okay.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon into the world. I'm Sönke. I work for an initiative called the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative. And what we do, we are a non-profit think tank and incubator on risk management and risk transfer solutions against climate change related impacts. So we also have different stakeholders in the organization, from civil society to academia to private sector. And we have a project office which is embedded within the United Nations University at the Institute of Environment and Human Security in Bonn. We do different types of work, from policy engagement, conceptual engagement like today, to risk analytics and also concrete implementation projects. Over.
Thank you, Sönke. Kairos?
Hi, good evening from Quezon City in the Philippines. I'm Kairos dela Cruz, and I lead the climate finance team of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, or ICSC. ICSC is an international NGO. As I've said, it's based in the Philippines, and we basically work on fair climate policy, particularly on climate finance and energy, and low carbon development, particularly in urban areas. I'm glad to be here and I look forward to the 1 hour discussion.
Great, thank you. So we have two presentations and then we'll open the floor for an interactive session where questions will be taken from the participants. So keep your questions ready. We'll open the floor after both speakers have spoken. For the first presentation, I'd like to invite Sönke. So you can share the screen and make your presentation.
Thank you, Vositha, for the welcome and the start of the session. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about food insecurity or food security and the risk perspective to it. I will also specifically talk about risk transfer instruments in the context of food security and insurance. And towards the end, I will talk about some of the bigger policy development in the field. I have to say in the beginning, I'm not a food security expert, so I'm only engaging on the topic on a tangent, but we are a risk management institution, and I also have that background. So, I will approach it from that perspective, and I think that's also the role for me today to bring about that risk management perspective. So let me start. Food security, it's important. I mean, we have to look at two things. We have to look at the supply side and also at the demand side. And I think this is an important differentiation. For example, if we now see the COVID pandemic definitely increases food insecurity. And what it does, it, for example, puts people into poverty, and due to the lockdown situation in some of the countries, more people couldn't work and things like that. That's also increasing food security, food insecurity. What I first want to focus on is actually more the supply side. And we all know that, for example, agriculture products are heavily dependent on climatic parameters. What you see on this slide is actually a paper, a very interesting paper last year. I think it's Nature Climate Change. It was, and what that group did, they looked at food shocks in different food production systems around the world. And what they see that there's an increasing overall in terms of food shocks and food production systems. So some of the highlights of the study is that more than 80% of the food insecure people live in countries that are actually prone to natural disasters or naturally induced disasters, including climate change induced disasters. And if you look at these kind of naturally induced hazards, you will find that climate disasters are actually the determining factors, the most predominant cause for that. And in the graph, what you can see, it actually depicts it, the time scales for cropping, for animal and meat production, fisheries, and agriculture. And what you can see that especially for crop production, overall, the mean number of shocks is increasing, and also the role of climate change related impacts is increasing over time. And I think this is only a harbinger to come. We all know that climate change impacts are increasingly and will further increase in the future. And so as a synopsis, what we can conclude is that we will see an increasingly a world that is increasingly insecure due to food supply shocks in the future. What also has to be said, there's an increasing interdependency. If like one food system is interrupted in one part of the world, that this might actually affect also other parts of the world. At the same time, it's also a risk-hedging instrument, but it's important to see that there are these interdependencies overall. What does this mean? This means that we actually need to look at a risk management perspective. We also have to set up preparedness mechanisms to handle these moments of crisis in an increasing shock-prone world. I would also argue that there's a role for climate risk insurance, and I will state a few examples later on how this could look like. I said I'm looking more on the supply side with this first slide, but obviously also the demand side is very important, and people not being in a position to afford the food with the equivalent calorie intake and that people will need, it is a big issue, and this has shown in this current pandemic crisis. What does follow from that? I think it also necessitates to have a deeper discourse and dialogue around social protection mechanisms and the role of social protection in food insecure regions. Okay, quickly now coming to the perspective of insurance. So I said it's important to apply risk management lens. Risk management actually has different ways. One or different strategies, different components. One is a risk reduction component, which means through, for example, preventive action, avoiding certain disaster situations altogether. In the context of climate change, this could be adapted cropping systems, irrigation schemes, things like that. There are also the next category of risk management is risk retention. And this could be, for example, building buffer capacities of certain crops so that impacts and shocks can be sustained. And then the last category of risk management is actually risk transfer, which describes the transfer of a risk, usually in return to financial payment. I will now focus more on also the role of risk transfer in providing food security. And just generally, this is from a publication that we did, I think, 4 years ago. There are different ways on how risk insurance or insurance can contribute also to the resilience, and I would argue the resilience of food systems. So one is, and not only in its function of providing, say, payouts, but also indirectly through, for example, peace of mind, or through a risk assessment, which is a necessary step in setting up a risk transfer strategy. So in terms of the concrete contributions of climate risk insurance to resilience, we have different resilience capacities, so anticipate, absorb, and adapt. And you can see that risk transfer might have different contributions to these resilience categories. So with risk assessment, it is possible to anticipate. Protection obviously is the biggest function of a risk transfer scheme. And you can, for example, replace affected assets more easily if you have a transfer scheme in place. You can also bundle different strategies and products. So that would be the promoting or the adaptation contribution. And also that's a big question or a big factor is to incentivize, for example, risk reduction behavior by setting up smart transfer schemes. This might sound a bit abstract, but I have concrete examples on the following slides. Just generally, what does risk transfer do? Risk transfer basically buffers shocks over time. And this is what the graph on my screen on the left side shows. You can see that with risk transfer, you can actually buffer this type of peaks in the losses, and you get it to the expected annual loss. But also, one has to say, against the premium. So the overall costs are higher than what would one expect in terms of the average annual loss. That's just the nature of it, due to, for example, certain loadings that are on the risk transfer. And also to say there are different ways on how to organize risk transfer insurance. There are the more classic indemnity-based products, which is around a loss adjustment process. So you have an event, you have a shock, you have a disaster, and afterwards you have a loss adjuster assessing the situation, assessing the damage, and then initiating the claim handling processes. The alternative is the parametric insurance, and especially in the context of agriculture, this is applied, whereby you have, for example, a plot of land, and the yield of that land will actually determine a payout. So you have like one example plot for a certain region, and if there's a drought and that example plot goes under a certain yield, then the payout will be initiated, or it will be connected to, say, certain Earth observation, satellite data, or even loss models itself. So the difference really is that you don't have a loss adjuster, a loss adjustment process. You go with a proxy. The problem with this system is that the loss situation on the ground might actually differ from your index or your proxy, and this is called basis risk. If you come across it, this is called basis risk. Generally, I think in the context of food security, what we are talking about, or there's a high potential to benchmark insurance payouts so that the payout actually provides a benefit in terms of food security. So that there's an insurance product which, for example, makes sure that the farmers can replant in time, and by that sustain food security objectives. Also an important notion, and already kind of discussed it. So insurance is, or risk transfer is always expensive, and it doesn't make sense to rely on a risk transfer strategy when it comes to very frequent events. So this it's more like a safety net. But really, when it comes to frequent events, other risk management strategies should be employed. And this is the conceptual model is called a risk layering framework, where risk prevention, risk reduction, retention is really applied to this kind of events that happen with a high frequency, but that don't have like a that don't result in a deep shock to the system, whereas for very rare but severe events, we are looking at different risk transfer options, and also, for example, by the private sector, but also transferring risk to the international community, for example. I want to give you 2 examples on how this can be organized concretely, and one is the World Food Program R4 experience in African countries. So it's right now programmed in 6 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, with its deepest involvement in Ethiopia, and it has different components. It works on risk reduction. It's also about setting up risk reserves, and also accepting certain parts of risk within the community. But it also does have a risk transfer component. For example, farmers that are part of the scheme, they can engage in risk-reducing activities, and as a return, they get, for example, insurance coverage at a reduced price, or even for free in return to these activities. So that's a way on holistically combining different risk management strategies. And it also has been evaluated that farmers under these systems overall increased their investments into productive assets. They have higher savings, with that also higher higher risk reserves, own risk reserves. They have higher mean incomes and production in stable crops. So overall, you can see that the program has benefits in terms of food security. The next example I want to bring up is not at the individual farmer level, but at the country level and even regional level. And this shows how a risk transfer instrument can actually be benchmarked according to food security objectives, and can really be a crucial instrument in sustaining food security in these regions. So Africa Risk Capacity, as well as ARC Replica, which is the arm directed to humanitarian actors and civil society organizations instead of government agencies. So it is a special organization of the African Union. It includes an early warning component. It's actually, there's a risk model, early warning model called Africa Risk View. This was also kind of the first step in setting up the scheme. It includes operational plans at the country level on how a country will react effectively and efficiently in the event of a in this case, drought disaster, and how they will, for example, disperse food items in order to fight food insecurity. And it includes insurance. So just a second. It includes an insurance mechanism as part of it. So there's a country risk pool. The different countries and also international donors pay into it. And it's actually owned by these countries. So the shareholders are the countries themselves. And the insurance mechanism pays out to the different countries in the eventuality of a disaster. And by that, it can objectively trigger the payout. So it's not like depending on some sort of flash appeal, which often comes after the fact with long delays. And it is also much faster. So as I said, for a flash appeal to be successful, often the disaster situation has to be very manifest. And with a risk model or with a loss model, you can already project that the situation will occur. You can mobilize the money through this insurance mechanism early on, and with that you of course have a more coordinated and at the end of the day also more cost-effective response. Yeah, so just some figures. It has proven in some of the African countries, and it has now been even added like a humanitarian agency component to it, so that it can, that also countries where government agencies are not as established and as effective, that countries can still benefit from this approach. Maybe a third element in terms of how climate risk insurance can directly provide benefits towards food security is that there are actually many schemes that directly target farmers at the farming level. One scheme, but farmers, okay. One scheme where we engaged, we are in a partnership with just a second. We are in a partnership with the Kreft, which is the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, and actually bringing also microinsurance solutions to the Caribbean. And one of the examples was that we had a parametric product, or we have a parametric product for fisher folks, and so they can actually insure against these disaster events, and this can, for example, alleviate their loss of income when they can't go out due to rough seas. Just like finishing up, two things I wanted to say, and then of course we can address the other items in the joint discussion, is that overall I think the role or the risk management perspective also on food security has increased attention overall internationally, specifically on risk transfer. There was a G7 initiative in 2015, and there's now an initiative called the Global Insurance Resilience Partnership, which is actually moving forward this topic. And there are also political milestones at the international level, and there are donors and donor initiatives that also specifically program these activities. And one, for example, is the ARC that I just mentioned as a case study before. And there are also initiatives in providing early finance, early action approaches, specifically or with large overlaps to the humanitarian sector. And there's an initiative called REAP. And I think what has been a good development, that these different initiatives are now coming together and also coordinating. And then maybe as my last slide, I wanted to highlight that obviously the quality of solutions, especially risk transfer solutions, depend on the user perspective. So it really needs to make a difference in these disaster situations, and there have been also a lot of issues and even some criticism to some of these risk transfer schemes when, for example, payout weren't delivered, or the loss model actually showed a different situation than the loss reality on the ground. And that's why we were promoting a principled approach as the first layer on how to increase the quality of these different products. And we promoted that within the Insurance Global Partnership, and these are called the PUR principles for climate and disasters finance and insurance. And you see like 5 principles, including to manage for impact, to manage for quality, ownership, complementarity also to other disaster risk management strategies, and lastly also equity concerns. And yeah, I just wanted to highlight these principles, and also in a way wanted to promote them. Yeah, and happy to take up any questions in the discussions, and also looking forward to Kairos' presentation to maybe get a more from a global, get a more national perspective and local perspective on how COVID-19 and climate change are affecting food security, and what can be done about it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. So we'll have all the questions together, like I mentioned before. So anything you have to check in with Sönke, please write them down, and we'll take them up after Kairos' presentation. So Kairos, the floor is yours.
Okay. Again, good evening, everyone from the Philippines. And thank you, Sönke, for the comprehensive presentation on the more or less international and national state of plays on CDRFI. Yeah, and hopefully in the next few slides that I will present, I'll be able to show what's happening in the Philippines, and how we can find a sweet spot between these different levels of analysis on how, and so we can have a better normal really soon. As I've said before, I'm Kairos de la Cruz. I'm the Senior Associate for Climate Finance of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. ICSC is an international climate and energy policy group based in the Philippines, advancing climate resilient and low carbon development. We have a whole array of different pieces of work that we do. On my last slide, I'll show you our website, just so you have an opportunity to browse around, just in case something piques your interest from my presentation. The Philippines, just so you know, just in case you haven't been to the Philippines is basically an archipelago smack in the middle of like the Pacific Ocean and the West Philippine Sea. In terms of climate change, the Philippines has a very high exposure to extreme episodic weather events, such as typhoons, storm surges, drought, flooding, among many others. On an average, we get 20 typhoons in a year. As of today, we're bracing for our 17th typhoon for the year, and it's only October. And in 2013, I'm quite sure that this has been quite historic. The super typhoon Haiyan hit the Philippines, wherein it wreaked havoc in pretty much half of the country and in the adjacent countries as well. Slow onset events and its effects are also creeping, and it's getting more obvious now for the Philippines. I mean, in terms of sea level rise, our Pacific coast, our eastern seaboard, is rising 3 times faster than the global average. Sea temperature and acidification are also on the rise. And the scary thing about slow onset events, or SOE, is that it does not have the same impact as an episodic event, for example, say typhoon. So imagining its impact and acting on it will have to take a different route, a different approach. And it's good that people are realizing it now, and then people are doing more researches about it, trying to find what it actually means. And so people are also slowly adapting to it. We do have a lot of policies on climate change and disaster risk reduction. We have a lot of offices tackling it. We have a bunch of non-government organizations doing their bits of work as well. But efforts in general, I think, haven't achieved the desirable impacts yet. There's been a report, I know, launched several years ago, and it simply says, that the approach on climate, it's either really fragmented, like people still think about, what they can do for their city or for their municipality, and not minding, shared resources such as a watershed or a mountain range, which results to really fragmented plans and fragmented approach, which sometimes in return are even more harmful. Or on the other side of things, we're still guilty of doing a one-size-fits-all. I mean, the Philippines is an archipelago of more than 7,000 islands. And trying to push for a single approach on adaptation, for a singular approach on how to plan better, it won't be that useful for some parts of the country. And we're still trying to find that balance between either we do to avoid a fragmentation or avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. Farmers, fisher folks, women, indigenous peoples, and children are identified as the most vulnerable. And for this presentation, let me focus on farmers and fisher folks. When we talk about COVID-19 and its impacts in the Philippines, apart from being the second highest in the region in terms of infections, and apart from being the world holder in the longest lockdowns, I mean, pre-COVID-19 food security is not something stellar in the Philippines as well. Based on a United Nations FAO report, the Philippines recorded the highest number of food insecure people in Southeast Asia from 2017 to 2019. And it simply means that there are millions of Filipinos suffering from moderate to severe lack of consistent access to food, which results in bad health, malnutrition, and stuff like that. And this is pre-COVID data. In addition to that, poor families also tend to eat less healthy food options when they have disposable income to purchase food, especially in urban areas, because healthy options tend to be priced higher or at a premium. My next slide simply shows, and I know that this might be a global thing, that people started keeping indoor plants during the quarantine periods, during the lockdowns. And I just decided to put it on my slide because in the Philippines, the situation now is that our rice, the price of rice, the wholesale price of rice is really low. It's beyond ideal. It's hurting our farmers, the backbone of our economy, really badly. To put things into perspective, I mean, people are willing to pay like $100 for a pot of really good indoor plants, and yet the ongoing rate for rice is something like 25 cents in US dollars. And the problem caused by COVID-19 and in the food security aspect of governance, it's obvious, and it has been recognized by the government. The Secretary of Agriculture, in one of his interviews, simply said, the threat of hunger is as real as the threat of COVID-19. And it's a domino effect. When the lockdown started happening, lockdown suspended work. It froze our economy, therefore cutting disposable income. And of course, those who are already living in the borderline, in the border of the poverty line, basically have no other choice but to slip into poverty. Lockdowns created challenges in the supply chain, especially with small farmer and fisher folk households. And eventually, it isn't a question anymore whether food is available, because when the supply line finally started running again, there's a realization that food is actually available. It's just that moving them at a rate that would keep the prices down is really difficult. And when it reaches the shelves, people with low or no income at all would have a huge problem of actually purchasing them. And when you bundle COVID-19 and climate change impacts, the challenges are really, it's huge, it's daunting. Climate change and the pandemic are happening at the same time. Climate change won't wait for the pandemic to be finished, for a miracle vaccine to be launched into the market. Climate change impacts is still there. So I've said we're bracing for our 17th typhoon this year, and we're still lucky that we haven't been in a situation wherein we have to face both at the same time and in a massive scale, similar to what we faced when Haiyan happened. It will be crucial to find solutions that would address both, ideally, or at the very least, the solution shouldn't hurt the other once it's implemented. And the solutions so far that's been, that has been coming out, it's quite promising, and I hope we get to a better normal really soon. Our Department of Finance and our economic managers in the National Economic and Development Authority have, they came up with a stimulus package approach on how to incentivize, businesses who are trying to go back to operations. They're trying to pump prime tourism efforts and so on. Our schools have started opening up in a modular approach as well. But in the same way, civil society efforts are being recognized as a crucial contributing factor on how we can move forward with climate change and COVID-19. For example, one of the things that we're working on right now, our urban resilience team in particular, we call it the Mobility Awards, wherein basically it seeks to incentivize local government units who are making bike-friendly cities, who are setting up infrastructure for alternative forms of mobility, such as biking, e-scooters, and so on. In the same way, the Mobility Awards try to put the spotlight on the people who carry a lot of load during this pandemic. Our delivery guys, our bike couriers, and so on. Just so to recognize that they're playing a crucial role in a way also in food security, because now goods can move from one place to another in a micro scale, and it opens up a lot of opportunities for additional employment and for households to start selling and buying back food products as well. The Department of Agriculture also launched their program Survive, Reboot, and Grow. It seeks to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 in the production lines, in the market access of people, and even contribute to the rural employment, which is badly needed. I'm quite sure that you've met a Filipino at least once in your life, because Filipinos, we tend to work outside the country. And with COVID-19, a lot of these overseas Filipino workers have to be repatriated back, and employment is a crucial point of discussion. And starting up and pump priming agriculture activities in the rural areas might be one of the solutions to that unemployment gap. Empower agri-fishery sector to take lead role in recovery and pump priming the economy. The Department of Agriculture has been quite set on its goal that transitioning our agricultural sector into a more industrialized sector would be crucial, and COVID-19 might set in a way a good staging point for that to actually happen. Risk transfer instruments have also been identified as a crucial addition to the mix. I mean, it would allow people it would give people breathing room to regroup and relaunch their enterprises if they have insurance coverage, for example. I know that the private sector in the Philippines, at least the local insurance companies, are also launching a COVID-19 insurance that they tend to bundle with existing health insurance through agricultural cooperatives and so on. So things are people are innovating, and it's resulting to good practices, which I hope would be institutionalized further in the coming years. Multi-actor partnerships is crucial. I mean, ICSC is leading this part of work with Sönke and the rest of the MAP global consortium, because we think that people need to talk more with each other. We need to better coordinate what we have so that the limited resources can actually be put into good use. And the multi-actor partnership plan to do that, particularly on climate and disaster risk finance, because sometimes your solutions is just on your own backyard. It's just that that discussion for that to happen hasn't happened yet, and MAP seeks to provide those kind of avenues. It is now recognized that it would be futile to return to the practices of a broken system when there is an opportunity to do things better. I mean, if there's something that I can consider as a silver lining for the Philippines, is that people are innovating, people are stepping up, and hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to go through this and we'll rise above, as a better Philippines, as a better nation afterwards. Yeah, maraming salamat. Thank you. That's my email address, just in case you have any questions, and that's our website, just in case you want to browse around the rest of ICSC's portfolio. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Kairos. I hope I got that right. Yes. So we now move on to our session, which focuses on questions. I will open the floor or the screen. I think I need to replace the floor with the screen these days. For any questions that the participants have. In the meantime, I will ask a few questions while they're typing them in. I found it interesting. I start from where you ended, actually, about the insurance system, which bundles COVID-19 impacts with other risks that are being handled. Would you like to explain a bit on how this is done? And maybe, Sönke, you could kind of bring the technical part of it into it as well. How additional things could be added on to what we are dealing with climate and disaster risk insurance.
Yeah, I mean, I only realized that, I mean, one of the biggest insurance companies in the Philippines, Pioneer Insurance, is doing a COVID-19 insurance coverage, and they've been rolling it out in the past few months, is through a course that I'm currently enrolled in with ILO. And it's quite interesting because the approach of that particular company is to provide really cheap insurance options. They did it quite well when dengue was the epidemic that everyone was talking about. They were providing dengue insurance coverage to a lot of people for, I think, $8 a year or something. And now they're trying that out with COVID-19. And they're facing a pretty difficult market right now because people are out of jobs, and people don't have much available disposable income on their hands. So they're trying to bundle that with existing insurance policies that they have. I think they're trying it out with health insurance coverage and those who have availed life insurance coverages under their company as well. So maybe it's not that direct to CDRFI, but I know that Pioneer has been trying to approach a lot of agricultural cooperatives to roll out their products.
Thank you. Sönke, would you like to add to the question or the answer that Kairos gave?
I mean, I don't know the particularities about that scheme in the Philippines. I mean, more from a general perspective, this risk can be covered, for example, as business interruption coverage to different companies and of various sizes, also small companies. I think generally there was a challenge, especially maybe more in the mature insurance markets, that the pandemic situation actually also surprised the insurance industry and everyone. And it's a global situation. So the insurance industry, its business model, especially reinsurance industry, is about globally diversifying the risk and spreading that out over location and time. And with everything affected at once, it can also result to a crunch in terms of insurance capacity. So I think I don't exactly know the particularities about that scheme and how it's exactly bundled and what's going to be the coverage conditions. But generally, it actually, for me, the COVID-19 situation is also a call to set up partnerships because it also shows the limits of a purely private market organized protection system. So it really has to be, I think, government-led initiatives, protection systems, together with private sector-driven ones. Yeah, just as a general response. I think there are some questions in the chat. If that's
yes.
Yeah.
So one of the questions, actually, it's two questions together. How can risk transfer instruments address the needs of informal workers in agriculture? How can we deal with challenges of uncertainty or lack of registration and records, for example, when it comes to land or livestock ownership? So the second part is about data, I believe, lack of data in general. And yeah, the first is obvious. So if you could just answer, either one or both of you could take the question.
Well, I can maybe try first step, and then Kairos, if you want to pitch in. So, I mean, on this question around evolution of schemes from indemnity-based to index or parametric one, I think the push towards exploring index-based approaches also because of some of the downsides with a more traditional model, and the downsides really are related to two things. One is timing. So often it is a process where, for example, the loss adjuster has a different opinion than the insuree, and things like that. So we are talking about timelines, maybe settlements that take months. And we know that the protection needs, especially for farmers that are really also very short in terms of their own cash liquidity, is that these protection needs are more urgent and more near term. So really long settlement processes are not helpful. So that, I think, was one push. The other push is also related to the costs, including loss adjustment processes, of course, are costly, and they add loadings to the risk-based premium, which makes it a less cost-effective risk management option. So I think this is the second one. I think this was also the reason why in Africa it has been tried. I'm not aware of a scheme that went from full indemnity to a full index. So I'm blank on this side. But what I also wanted to say is maybe the dichotomy of these different approaches is also not necessarily true. You can also combine it. You can say, provide an early payout for parts of the damage, but you can still have a loss adjusting process for some of the cases where, for example, the loss reality is different, or there are different options. There's also the options of ex gratia payments, so that people can also claim themselves, but they will nevertheless receive an automatic payout from an index-based system. So so there are different models, and there are also some examples on how this can be done. Then on the question around informal workers in agriculture and how they can benefit. I mean, first is the agriculture, the informal workers, to my understanding, are also indirectly affected if, for example, the farming sector in itself is affected. So if the farm has to close, even temporal agricultural workers also are losing their jobs. So that's one thing. But I'm not aware on like specific products that are only for the informal and temporal workers in these contexts. I'm not aware on this one. In terms of data availability, this is a challenge not only to informal workers, but also to kind of more formal agriculture enterprises, especially in developing countries. And there are some ways to leapfrog the problematic data availability situation. And one is Earth observation systems, I think, is something which really is a difference. Satellite-based systems where you can automatically map certain cropping systems, for example, and also track water availability levels in the soils, etc., etc. And you can then structure your payouts based on that. The other one is also on the entire contract management, insurance contract management. And so people are experimenting, for example, with blockchain approaches, so that this can also be done in the context of say, less established markets where this is not existing. So just as an idea on how to go about the data availability question.
Kairos, would you like to add to what Sönke mentioned? There is a question for you specifically, also, but we can take it after yours.
Yeah, I would just like to add on the question on the informal sectors. I mean, it's a challenge. It has been reoccurring. It has been a recurring discussion for the Philippines as well, because we do have a lot of informal sectors, and despite the introduction of like new approaches on CDRFI, such as the Sustainable Insurance Facility of the V20 and IGP, I mean, it's still a challenge because it's still a gray area. Like before, the coverage would usually be SMEs, and now MSMEs, you know, but then you're still leaving out a considerable amount of people, of those who are working on informal industries. And what we saw so far on the ground is that, you know, I mean, getting registered and getting recognized as a part of a cooperative, for example, might be a good approach, might be a good practical approach for the informal actors to be covered. And in terms of private sector approaches on that, I mean, we even have pawn shops here in the Philippines who are offering, insurance policies that you can buy every day. You can pay like $1 every day just so you're covered for that day. Just to add some flexibility for the informal sector members. In terms of the question directed to me on the reason behind the rice price crash in the Philippines, it's a combination of really bad policies on we have a rice tariffication law, which I think messes up. I'm not an expert on it, but I'm quite sure that it messes up the economics of rice pricing, because now our farmers have to compete with other rice producers in the region, which are more or less getting subsidies in terms of taxes. So our farmers are dealt with a very bad hand on that one. Plus, the post-processing of rice is usually controlled by very small group of businessmen who can really drive the price down. Yeah, and on the additional comment, I do believe that mental well-being of farmers and fisher folks is one of the things that have been left out for many years, which has to be attended really soon. Suicide rates in the Philippines, particular to the agricultural sector, it's not that much of a talked about issue, but it has been recorded in the past few months, particularly after when the pandemic happened.
Yeah. Thank you, Kairos. There was something about youth that was asked, but we can get back to it after the question that is there for Sönke. So there's a question asking you for good examples of public-private partnerships regarding risk transfer in developing countries. I believe you gave a few examples, but they weren't necessarily public-private partnerships. So do you have anything specific you would like to share?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously it is context specific, but there are quite a few examples. So on the sovereign level, for example, the Africa Risk Capacity or the Kreft, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, they are examples because they are public sector, private sector. They are organized according to private sector principles, but they're mutually owned insurance company or insurance capture by these countries. So this could be one example on the and it's addressing actually the liquidity shortfalls of countries in one way or the other in the context of food security for Africa, and in the context of general response to tropical storm events in the Caribbean. So and this is one example. We also have examples on the data side, because there we have the same challenge. For example, an insurance company, it's difficult. An insurance company cannot invest into public data goods, or cannot sustain the full investment of public data goods. Yeah. One example is the global earthquake model, where it's actually a partnership between research institutions and also the private sector, and it's now organized as a non-profit foundation based out of Italy, and they provide these kind of earthquake models, and through that also provide some kind of consensus understanding on earthquake risk. And earthquake is very difficult to model, and there were also a lot of issues for insurers to actually correctly price, for example, earthquake risk, and there are also limits to insurability on earthquakes. So that's why I'm it's not a climate risk, but I'm pointing this out as an example. And then there are also examples at the national level. I think Mexico with its funding scheme is quite interesting, where they connect their official disaster management response to also an insurance pool set up nationally. And also I believe that Morocco is right now implementing a very interesting protection scheme, including a fund approach for the most vulnerable people that cannot afford insurance premiums, and also some insurance premiums, all is financed by a tax on insurance in Morocco. And it's also the loss adjustment will be done through the insurance company. So you basically combine the capacities on loss adjustment and the system, and you also and I think that makes it interesting to the insurers. You also showing the added value of insurance to the people, and people already get acquainted with insurance, and once they become, say, richer, or they can afford these kind of approaches, then they're also going to the insurance industry, and the insurance industry itself is able to increase its market share. So that are some of the examples. But there are probably also more. Just to picking up some of the other questions. So there was the one on mental problems, and whether there need to be specific products. I don't think that probably that is not the need for a specific product, but when we talk about the value proposition of insurance in terms of climate risks and also COVID-19 risk, what I failed to say, of course, a big part of the COVID-19 impact is, for example, covered through health insurance. And this is in itself a big field, and it also then depends on the exact coverage, and often it's actually a mix of public and private approaches again. I just wanted to mention that also for life insurance is important in terms of COVID-19. I assume to picking up part of that impact. And then there was a question on agriculture. Wait, I have to. Okay, what are the basis risks? I mean, basis risk is what I already explained. This is the difference in loss, the difference between the loss situation on the ground and the payout. And this is a problem and a challenge with parametric approaches. I just want to say it's not necessarily that if these kind of technical challenge, if there's like a further technological development and the risk models become better and better and better, so that the basis risk can be minimized, even though I would also argue it will never go away with parametric approaches. So one needs to also look for kind of alternatives or added coverage options. What I wanted to say, this is not the only barrier to insurance in the agriculture sector. One big issue is that agriculture in itself is very exposed, which also makes insurance very pricey. And so what you often see is that you actually have, again, a mix of public systems as well as a private system. So that part of it is actually government-led and government-organized. If you look at the India insurance scheme, it's a government-led initiative. And so affordability of insurance is an issue within the agriculture sector. Insurability is an issue within the agriculture sector, just because the sector is very exposed. And if there are, for example, wider societal objectives and benefits, then also there's the question how to organize this in a PPP approach. Many developed countries are actually subsidizing the agriculture insurance systems. for that reason. So just bringing this out, it's not the only barrier. Technology is not the only barrier to insurance uptake in the agriculture sector. Yeah.
Thank you, Sönke. We just get Kairos to answer the question on youth because it links with the partnerships as well, and how you see them engaging in risk management or the agriculture and food security. And if you want to add a bit on the barriers as well, you could do that while you're answering the other question.
Yeah. On the youth, on the engagement of the government in general to the youth sector in particular, I mean, I think the government is, has taken a popular approach around it. They got, popular personalities to talk about why agriculture is important and how they can help. But in general, I think there's been an uptake on urban agriculture, on urban farming during the pandemic, especially when people start realizing that food products might not be as available as they used to be. So there's been an increase of, when you walk around Manila now, you can see pots with eggplants and other produce. That's not the case before. And I think the engagement with the youth is almost similar to the engagement to those who are repatriated back to the provinces. I think a lot of stimulus packages will be rolled out in the succeeding months after we sort of stabilize the situation in terms of the actual infections and the actual medical difficulties that we have in the Philippines. So I think that's the next step that the Department of Agriculture will take. What civil society can do about it and other non-state actors can do about it is to complement those actions and actually provide additional input to it, as most of the technologies on agriculture has been nurtured and released by civil society organizations and other modality, particularly on the other forms of farming. So now people are doing, hydroponics, mushroom farming has been increasing in the past few months, aquaponics and so on. So that's something, that's I think a good development despite the pandemic. Yeah, and on the barriers on insurance coverage, I mean, the Philippines, I think we still have one of the oldest, like 100% subsidized government insurance policy for agriculture, and it's it has shown its weaknesses in the past few years, and people are trying to improve that system because we since it's an 100% subsidized insurance policy, it can only cover this much of the total farming population, and it's not making a dent in terms of improving the resilience of the overall population. So now people are finding ways on how to get more actors on board, how to get the private sector more active, and I think that's where the multi-actor partnerships would play a crucial role, how to ensure that that discussion happen and how it would happen in a propositional manner wherein maybe it would not result to new products, but definitely it will result to policy changes that we can see in the next few years in the Philippines.
Thank you, Kairos. There's a question for you, which is about populations that are working outside and then reviving farmlands. I am not sure that you saw this. It's quite a long question. So congratulations on the Philippines innovative stepping up as always, blah, blah. So Sri Lanka is also having some, have you read the question? If yes, then you could directly answer. Yes, thank you.
I don't have a direct answer to that. I think the reaction would always be mixed. I mean, if you, but I'm quite sure that people would appreciate, employment, the availability of employment options, particularly in these trying times. I mean, I don't think we can point to direct, success stories this early on, but I'm quite sure that people are taking that up with their local government units as well. And if I can share, I mean, one of the schemes that some of the local government units employed during the pandemic is that they tried to buy their relief from local producers as well, to cut down costs and to ensure that these people would have disposable income throughout the pandemic. So it became, quite a fad, to be honest, on the social media here in the Philippines, that you see, a coastal community giving out like fish freshly caught by fisher folks to their communities as well, and then the local government units are paying at least at a premium price, just so people have extra money that they can use throughout the pandemic. Yeah, and on the last question that on the last question on the chat box, I don't think I don't think maps would be an easy an easy thing to do. Establishing it might be easy, but making it operational would be difficult. And even if we're a think tank that has some years already on our belt, it would still take a lot of work for us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I had the last question, but before that, there's another last question that came in the chat box. So it's to Sönke. Could you just quickly read the question? It's about different kinds of insurance schemes.
That's also not like a short question, so give me like a second to read it. Yeah. So I think what the question is about is also to maybe highlight gender dynamics when it comes to insurance approach, and I think it's an important topic. I mean, from several perspectives. One is that risk perspectives might be different. For example, that like women are more risk aware and hence also a driver in proactively buying insurance instead of waiting out a disaster risk. So I think that's one. And also the needs, they just might be different. And I think this is related to it. Again, I don't know the specific example. I wasn't part of the webinar, but I can easily see it. So it actually requires both insurers to be to employ gender-sensitive approaches, and it also requires some of the agencies that are promoting PPP approaches to look at this topic. So yeah, so the question is there. It's also a little bit a comment. So I think it's very important just in terms of marketing to be sure about it, that there are differences in terms of coverage conditions, that there are differences also in terms of say the dynamics around ownership, that there are differences, and also that the insurance product in itself should not perpetuate maybe situations where, for example, women or men lack access to certain services as a result of gender dynamics. So just highlighting, I think, the comment within the question, I'm of the same opinion. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So last question for both of you. We've been talking a lot about risk transfer and climate insurance in the agriculture sector. Going back to climate change and impacts of climate change, what do you identify as entry points that we can have in the next few, or like in the short term, to address food security as well as risk assessments, that sort of area of focus that we have? I'm going with the NDC, NAP, Sendai. Do you see anything that we can build on? If so, at country level, what could be the entry points and key things to focus on? Either one of you could answer, or both of you.
go first this time for a change. uh, yeah, I mean, as I've said in my presentation, I mean, we do have a lot of policies and mandates in the Philippines. And one of, I mean, even before the NDC discussion started, even before NAP, even before Paris, I mean, the Philippines has mandated, for example, local government units to come up with local climate change action plans. And what it simply means is that, you know, local government units, like municipalities, cities, and provinces, should start doing risk and vulnerability assessments and start planning around using those risk and vulnerability assessments. And I think the Philippines, we don't have, you know, the perfect setup yet, but I think we made, you know, advances when we passed the People's Survival Fund into law. It's our National Adaptation Fund because it tries to incentivize local government units and local communities who has a good plan, but by providing long-term financing for them, for at least for the adaptation components of these plans, which I think it's a good entry point, and we're looking forward on how to account for these local initiatives, because there's a lot in the Philippines. I mean, more could be done, but there's a lot of good adaptation example that's been happening and has been funded. Some of them have been funded as well by the People's Survival Fund. So we're looking for ways on how to sort of elevate those experiences and examples to further contribute to the discussion on the NDC and on the NAP discussion.
Thank you, Kairos. Sönke, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, there's a dialogue to have to be more proactive in terms of disaster risk management, and this definitely includes also climate change. The challenge is to move towards ex-ante approaches because managing disaster situations after the fact is often uncoordinated, is often unfair. Different groups and different populations have different access, for example, in a disaster situation to say government assistance and things like that. So I think pushing the approach from managing disasters to managing disaster risk is very important. And it is good that, for example, processes like the Sendai Agreement, or also countries as part of the NDCs are actually pushed to make that a policy debate within these countries. So I think this is one entry point. And then it is an implementation debate. It's also, there are a lot of challenges with the different instruments, things like that, but this is always to be expected. I think this is the one part. The other part as on climate change is also that it will increase the uncertainty in the future. I mean, there's this picture of a black swan event. So essentially like really big events that no one had in the cards and didn't expect before. And the global pandemic, even though people were highlighting the possibility, is probably one of these black swan events where you can only after the fact really say how things play out, and you cannot directly project that. So and climate change will also create this black swans events, I'm quite sure. And this doesn't mean to put your head into the sand and say we are not going to do anything about it because we cannot see how the future will play out. Of course, there's always like uncertainty and like, yeah, the future is foggy. We can already we already see some of we are knowing that future is more shock prone, that impacts will increase and things like that. And so what I'm taking out of it is that in addition to better managing disasters, managing disaster risk, we also need to manage for the capacities, the buffer capacities, the capacities within the countries to also react to eventualities that cannot be projected. And for that, I think linking everything into this kind of resilience paradigm, which is a bit vague in times, and to also kind of transformation paradigm is also important. So we have two elements. One is ex ante management of risks instead of disasters, and the other one also like embedding that in a longer term development and transformation process as a direct response to how society should react to climate change impacts or climate change overall.
Okay, thank you very much, both of you, for the very interactive session. A lot of information gathered and food for thought for us to move forward in the work that we're doing. And all the participants who asked a lot of questions, very long questions, and also very to the point and related questions. So it was a good discussion. And thank you, Sönke. I know you're very tired. And it's quite late in the Philippines, and I'm in office at as well. So thank you very much, both of you, and look forward to talking to you again at a different time. And thank you, everyone, and bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.